Welcome back to the next episode of Let's Talk Security Testing, the podcast where we talk all things security testing. Today, we are looking at, I don't know, how would you describe it? Our version of a cut-down threat model that's, I guess, actually useful when we're doing continuous development. Threat modeling is a fantastic thing to do, but often when we talk about development, it's usually in the context of big systems or big implementations of new features, etc., and covers a wide array of things. But actually, there's a part to threat modeling which really is considering the weaknesses or vulnerabilities we might be introducing when implementing the system and things to consider. And that part of it can be really useful for everyday changes. Is that right?
Yeah, I think a simple way to look at it is just thinking about what could go wrong at a granular level, right, on every ticket or every pull request or whatever it is that you use in your SDLC to break up the changes that you make agile, or the risk associated with agile changes or incremental changes.
Yeah. And I know we don't usually make this podcast about Cytix, and Let's Talk Security Testing and Cytix aren't necessarily the same thing, but Cytix has recently launched part of our API on our website, which allows anybody, there's no login or nothing, you can just go on and paste in development tickets, and you can start interacting with our platform to get some of these results. So realistically, what would it typically spit out, Tom?
Well, for 90 or 80 to 90% of tickets that most developers are doing, it'll spit out a statement that no testing is required, excuse me, or that there's no particular risk associated with it, right? Because for most of the changes that people are making inside their business, it's things like updating copy or the size of an image or colours and things of that nature that aren't going to introduce vulnerabilities. But in those small number of cases where you're doing some sort of a change that might introduce a vulnerability, introducing functionality that could have risks associated with it, it'll spit out a list of the types of vulnerabilities that we might expect to see from that, and in fact also a summary of why we believe that kind of a vulnerability might be relevant to this particular kind of a change that you're looking at.
So within that, we have got a good idea. We are going to test the tool live against our accomplished security engineer, Tom. I'd like to think that you could do this job in a business. I know you don't like to blow your own trumpet, but I guess just maybe share some credentials with the audience to make sure this is a valid test.
Sure. Me against the machine. I think this is reminds me of I think the last time that a machine went up against a person, it was about who's going to make a railway faster, and the guy ended up winning but died in the process. I've been in the cybersecurity space for about 11, 12 years. Was a pen tester for the first 9-ish years of my career. The last few years have been sort of hybrid, running cybersecurity company and helping build out obviously products and product related features in order to enable the cybersecurity thing. But yeah, certainly calling back to earlier in my career, I've been testing applications, infrastructure, cloud, the whole wealth of different things. Basically, if it's got a button or a padlock, I've tried to break in or out at some point.
Brilliant. And what we're going to do, for those listening, you won't necessarily see me do this, but if you're watching, you should be able to see my screen if the edit has happened correctly. So I've got some tickets here that Tom is not allowed to see. These are tickets that I've created, so hopefully they play nicely. So the first one that we're going to input is add a markdown comment capability to the application to allow users to annotate case files related to their project. So I guess just so if anyone's not clear, what we're trying to do here is just put some examples together of what change tickets might just frequently be written inside a business in a way that a developer might write them, or a project manager might write them, or whoever's doing the tickets. What you're now looking at is the very tool that I said. It can be found on our website under resources and then change analysis tool. I think it's also on the homepage as well, but don't quote me on that. So simply going to paste this in here, not using the ones on the left because Tom will already know those ones. There we go. We're analysing the ticket. So we'll wait for this to come up. I guess while we're waiting for it, I'll just read it out again, Tom. Add a markdown comment capability to the application to allow users to annotate case files related to their projects. Tell me what we should be concerned about here.
Well, I mean, I guess anytime you're trying to add in a comment, or anytime a user is allowed to provide an input that is, for all intents and purposes, uncontrolled by the application, the biggest risk is like a cross-site scripting or an input validation issue where you're trying to, where an attacker might be trying to add in a JavaScript payload or a piece of HTML or something that then gets rendered back when other people view the page. So I think I'd lean towards saying cross-site scripting, but anything in that category of vulnerability.
Awesome. The cat tool has said cross-site scripting and improper input validation.
Wonderful.
It's 2 ticks. Just for context, when we talk about improper input validation, it's talking about when we're handling user-supplied markdown comments, it could potentially lead to various injection vulnerabilities, such as HTML injection, script injection, you get the point. Cross-site scripting, we're talking about allowing users to input markdown comments could potentially lead to cross-site scripting if the input is not properly sanitized and validated, etc., etc. So we can see how this is, I guess, useful, but also a lot of the reason I think it's so important to compare this to Tom is because a lot of businesses are already doing this stuff. You know, certainly those that are following kind of mature kind of DevSecOps guidance, etc. But, you know, the important thing to talk about here, and we spoke about this a little bit on the last episode, AI might not be able to do the hacking. But I guess what we are demonstrating is that AI is more than capable of replacing some of the human tasks that go into running an effective DevSecOps program.
And certainly some of the tasks that at the moment businesses don't always do or struggle to get done. I think one of the big applications of language models is being able to do the, I hasten to call it menial tasks, but the tasks that can be at scale quite challenging to do because it's a lot of the same process over and over again, even if they're not completely infallible. Like on that last one, I'd argue, well, we kind of got the same things. Input validation issues, cross-site scripting, it's kind of the same thing, but it's decided to split them out. So even though it's not completely perfect in being able to do that, the cool thing is it's pretty good at doing it, and if you're not doing it at all, or if you're only doing it some of the time, it's much, much better than that.
Yeah, and obviously what it produces is obviously then a really good mechanism for determining which ones to look at from a human perspective, because just saying that's a risky change, so by what definition? What do you mean by risky? How risky? Well, by taking away the word risky change and associating potential vulnerabilities against it, you can trigger for different things that are important to your business. If a automated system tells us this ticket might introduce cross-site scripting, and cross-site scripting is important to us as a business, then we can make sure that that one gets flagged for the more serious review. It's a much better indicator than simply saying it's risky, it's not risky, by the opinion of often a low-level analyst or whoever's been given the job to sift through Jira. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that's often not the most senior member of staff.
No, and we can almost quantify the risk that way, right? There are vulnerabilities that matter to particular businesses and vulnerabilities that don't matter as much to those businesses, and you can actually start to make a bit of a judgment call about whether or not maybe a change does need a bit more testing before it goes into production, because it's got the scary vulnerabilities versus a vulnerability that you're happy to push into production. Sure. Because you as a business don't really consider that issue to be existential.
But Maybe that was a fluke. Maybe the AI is better than Tom. Maybe Tom is better than the AI. Should we find out?
I'll give it a go.
Next ticket. Fix the bug where some users are reporting that they are unable to log out.
Okay, so anything related to log out and log out related issues, I'm immediately thinking like session termination related vulnerabilities. So ineffective session termination or session fixation, session handling issues, I guess is the overarching, I think, CWE for that particular class of vulnerability. I do wonder. It's hard to tell how far to push it with this. I think if I was to read that ticket, I'd probably go in at and start digging into that. If I was to really push it and think that the model's overly paranoid, there may be some issues around sort of forced browsing related stuff that you could consider as well. But that's probably a little unrealistic for a lot of tests. Anyway, so yeah, I think session handling vulnerabilities, particularly around session termination and at a push, maybe like forced browsing related issues.
Yeah, pretty much. Session fixation, session management flaws is what the model has generated. So session fixation, we're looking at the logout functionality as a critical part of session management. If there are issues with the logout process, it could lead to session fixation vulnerabilities. Session management flaws, issues with the logout functionality could also be indicative of broadened session management flaws, such as improper session exploration or insufficient session validation. These flaws could allow an attacker to maintain unauthorized access to a user's account or perform actions on behalf of the user.
Cool.
Yeah? Tick, tick.
I'll take it.
Yeah, tick, tick. I guess what's also interesting about this one is this is a bug fix.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who's listening. I hope someone's listening. I don't know who's listening that actually has a process like this in their business. Be interesting to hear from people if you are listening and are wanting to engage in a bit of a discussion. But what we see more often than not are things like, minor changes don't go through this process. Bug fixes have got no chance of going through this process. Often these things are hot fixes to prod. They've been passed straight to the development team. The development team are often burdened to fix these issues quite quickly because often bugs can be, P1s, P2s, that type of thing. And the processes aren't built in for things like bug fixes.
Yeah, well, I think we hear a lot of talk about things like cliff edge pen testing or pen testing of material changes,
Yeah.
And the idea that it is the number of lines of code or hours of work that has gone into something that directly influences the amount of vulnerabilities that are within it is almost the reverse logic in a lot of cases. The faster you do something, and the less and the sort of smaller that it is, sometimes will result in more issues, right? Because you've not introduced the logic to handle every exception. You've not followed all of the traditional processes. You kind of just potentially rushed through something, or you've made something that's super simple without any consideration to the edge cases, and that by virtue of those characteristics is much more likely to be vulnerable than several months worth of architected and planned development.
Yeah, 100%. So let's just do one more. This one shouldn't take long. Add ARIA labels to all buttons within the application for improved accessibility.
So I don't think that there's really any risks that I see with that change. It's a front end change for accessibility purposes. It's not really adding in anything that a user can manipulate. It's not changing anything about the configuration. The there are potential to break UI components for usability, but from a security perspective, I don't think that there's going to be any vulnerabilities as a result of changing or adding ARIA labels to an application. Interested to know what the model says though.
I think on this occasion, Tom, the model thinks it. I'm only joking. Not testable. Not testable. That's 3 out of 3. That's not bad. That's not bad. It'd be good to know what the audience thinks, but I think that, if this can competently do the job of a person that's already doing that job, one of two things will happen. Either this will free up a bunch of time for security analysts working inside application VM programs, in which case, great. On the flip side, this will help to finally achieve some of the aspirational goals of some of the teams that simply would never be able to implement that because they don't have the resources for a full-time head to do that job. There's also potentially a third angle here, which is where we're seeing more often than not now that the responsibility for this is being pushed onto development teams. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with that, because taking some accountability for thinking about security before you do something is not something that I think should be replaced inside a business. However, like with all AI products, helping somebody to get there and then validating and checking their work after the fact, that's exactly what AI is here for, and it's not impeding on our ability to learn as humans. It's simply helping us to just be more accurate and get things right more often.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think when you mention about validating things, one of the problems that I see in DevSecOps or in security inside the SDLC is we're often not very good at passing information from one stage to another. So one of the cool things that I particularly appreciate about this from a pen testing background is the fact that information that's being used to identify to the developer the kinds of vulnerabilities that might be introduced actually gets passed to the pen tester as well, and so they're not going in blind, they're going in with the considerations of the security criteria that were set out from the offset. You might be doing threat modeling of development tickets to say, like you said, this is a risky change, this isn't a risky change, but if you're also telling that tester the wider context of why it's a risk and what you should do with that, and giving them effectively a distilled version of the information that the original developer had to be able to make their decisions, I think the output is inevitably going to be better for everybody.
Awesome. Well, I hope this was interesting for people listening. We've certainly enjoyed doing it. I think in summary, like I said, AI, lots of things it can't do. We covered that on the last episode. I'm glad we're able to do an episode where we spoke about something it can actually do and can actually do competently. Anyone's interested, Cat Tool's available on our website completely for free, cytix.io. Go to resources, Cat Tool, no login, no registration required, and it communicates directly with our API, and we actively want people using it. So hopefully that can be of use. But for now, that's it from us, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye now.